Hello, welcome to season 2. Today we are in the episode 1 of the season 2 Perfect Beer Talks, and I have a great guest from UK. Before introducing him, I want to say about him. First, I met with him unphysically in Manchester in a very unique hotel with his book Man Walked into Pub. Pete Brown, an author, journalist, broadcaster, beer lover. But for me, he is the Walt Whitman of the beer. So, welcome, Pete. How are you?
Thank you very much. I've been called the Bill Bryson of beer before, but that's a step up. I'll take Walt Whitman.
Do you know why I say Walt Whitman?
No.
Because in Walt Whitman poetry, he always combined the humor with the anthropology. And in all of your books, I understand that you are focusing on the beer from both sociologically and anthropologic side. So it impressed me so much. I want to talk deeply today.
Okay, fantastic.
So, could you introduce yourself for our audience, please, Pete? Let's start with that.
So I'm Pete Brown. I am a British beer writer. We're going to talk about all this in a lot more detail, but I used to work in marketing and advertising, and I gave that up in order to write full-time about beer. And I've been named Beer Writer of the Year 4 times, won a bunch of other awards. I've written 12 books, and I write a lot of other things as well. I've got a blog, a website at petebrown.net. And yeah, just as you said, I write about beer because it's a way for me to write about all sorts of other things. I think beer touches every aspect of our lives, our history, our culture. And that's why it's an endless fascination for me. So
it's great to start the season 2 with a guy who really passionate about the beer. Pete, I know you are a former board level strategic planner that has worked with some of the world's largest advertising and branding agencies, such as Heineken, Stella Artois, Guinness. Please tell us about your journey. How was working with all of these brands to develop expertise in this sector? What were the different aspects for working with varieties of brands? We would love to hear about your experience, insights in these long years.
I worked in advertising through the 90s and into the start of the 2000s. And that was a good time for beer. And I started working on beer about halfway through that career, working on Stella Artois and Heineken in the UK to begin with. And I just found it fascinating. At the time, beer was, it was before craft beer had hit Britain. It was very much lager with kind of real ale in the background. And the lager brands were the brands that had the big advertising budgets. It was Heineken, it was Carlsberg, it was Carling. And what I found so interesting about it was trying to differentiate those brands when, most things, if you're doing advertising, you try to tell a story about what the product does and why it's better. With beer, you're not allowed to mention or even imply what the product does. You're obviously not allowed to say it gets you drunk. That's a big no-no. You can't even say it helps you with social interaction. It helps relax you. It helps you make friends. It helps you bond with people. These are all the very true things that beer does. You're not allowed to say them in advertising because beer is an alcoholic substance. So you have these brands where you're not allowed to talk about what they do or why people drink them. So you have to come up with something else to say about them. So it was all about building brand personality and hoping that you could build a personality for the brand that the consumer would identify with and go, yeah, that's the kind of group I want to be in. And so it was very much about creating one brand versus another, keeping it relevant and fresh, and really having to understand the consumer in order to do that. And that was my job, was really getting under the skin of beer drinkers, of lager drinkers, and getting to know them so that we could then write things that were relevant to them.
Thanks for your answer, Pete. When we catch you, so many things to talk. So I want to ask you, the evolution of beer advertising is really interesting. As you mentioned in your book, beer advertising was considered promoting the brewer's name on the fronts of pubs, on the sides of buildings. And you mentioned that the first and campaign comparable to anything we know today came from Guinness.
Yes.
What was it about that made it comparable to today? How did beer advertising evolve after Guinness game changer historic moment? And finally, how would you describe today's world beer advertising?
So this is very much from a UK perspective, obviously. The book where I wrote about this just did focus on the UK, so it may be different in other countries. But 120 years ago, the brewers of beer owned the pubs that sold their beer. So if you were the Courage Brewery, you owned a couple of thousand Courage pubs that sold Courage beers and didn't sell anyone else's. If you were a Whitbread pub, you sold Whitbread beers, and so on. And Guinness was the only beer brand in the UK and Ireland that pursued a different route. What they did was they didn't buy pubs. They just tried to sell Guinness into everybody else's pubs. And Guinness proved more popular than, say, Whitbread Stout or Courage Stout or whatever. And so every pub could sell all their own beers, but they had to sell Guinness when it came to stout. And so Guinness capitalized on that. And about the 1930s, they started making ads because they had to promote the brand rather than the pubs. And their first campaign had a line which is "Guinness is good for you."
Guys, do we have a Guinness?
You know, you could not get anywhere close to that these days. There's this thing about Guinness containing a lot of iron. Pregnant women and women who just given birth felt that Guinness made them feel better. So Guinness would advertise with "Guinness is good for you." And eventually that was banned. It's like, you can't say that about beer. You can't say that about beer.
When it was in the 90s or 80s?
1930s.
1930s.
Yeah. So it goes right back to then. And then they got this great illustrator who created all these cartoon characters, these animals. So the main one was a toucan, a bird with a massive beak. And the toucan would balance a pint of Guinness on the end of its beak. And these images were they just made people smile. And nobody else was advertising like that at the time. So Guinness built this brand reputation. As you get to the 1970s, beer advertising moves on to TV. And by this time, has to be much more abstract. It also be a lot more suggestive. You can't say Guinness is good for you anymore. And so they just made very funny ads. And they also made the pint very iconic. If you showed a computer graphic now to someone anywhere in the world of a pint glass with black liquid and a white head, they would say, "Oh yeah, that's Guinness." So they just made that very visible. And they always held the gold standard for doing really great TV ads. They became more cinematic, they became more dramatic, they became more creative. A Guinness ad from 1997 featured these surfers surfing huge waves, and you get white horses coming out of the waves turn into horses. And it's a stunning thing to watch. And it's all about waiting, because Guinness needs to be 2 minutes for the perfect Guinness pour on draft. So waiting for the perfect wave, waiting for the perfect pint of Guinness. And it just got they just became these iconic things. And there's a curious thing now that in the UK, more people claim to drink Guinness than actually do drink it. More people claim to drink Guinness than any other beer. And it's not true. So the ads are so cool that people want to be seen as Guinness drinkers, even when they don't like drinking Guinness. It's the brand is bigger than the beer. But you don't get advertising like that anymore, because around the time I was working in it, the regulations tightened even further. I know in places like France, you're not even allowed to have people in TV ads for beer. And it got a little bit more like that here as well. On top of the fact that you used to spend a lot of money making an ad, you would put it on TV in a big program, like a big soap opera or something. And, half the UK adult population would see that ad. And then when we all got cable and satellite TV, and we've all got hundreds of channels now, you just don't get that big mass audience anymore. So you have to advertise in a different way now. You have to communicate with people in smaller groups online and places like that. So the creativity has gone out of advertising, which I think is a big shame.
In this point, I want to move the topic to more specific. We all know beer is a social drink. And besides of the UK, most markets, beer brands makes their big revenues from the off-trade, not on-trade. Mm-hmm. But on-trade, because beer advertisements is banned in so many countries, on-trade is an experience center. Is a big marketing channel for the beer brands. Mm. So, what do you think about the on-trade experience marketing. How do beer brands use on-trade as a marketing channel? Do you have any unique examples in the history about on-trade marketing?
Good question, because you see brands, they just want to create visibility and presence in the on-trade. And the way any brand does that is just by producing branded merchandise. So, you go into a bar and you see Heineken umbrellas, Heineken stands, Heineken beer mats, Heineken whatever, or in Japan, it's like you get these bars where Asahi everywhere, there's nothing else that you can see. And I think that's a little bit like shouting at the consumer. You're just shouting your name in the drinker's face again and again and again. And I guess we don't notice it. But there's a word in marketing, activations, which, bringing an idea to life on the ground. And I think if you get creative with your activation, instead of just putting your logo and your brand name everywhere, the standard for me is if you can actually genuinely make the drinker's experience better than it would have been if you hadn't been there. So we've given you a more comfortable seat. We've given you something interesting to watch. We've given you a nicer glass. We've somehow made your experience better. And one thing that Stella Artois used to do when we were working on it was put on free classic movie screenings in public parks. And there'd be a bar there selling Stella Artois. If you want to take your own beers, you could. And it was still simply going, look, we've had this screen, we're putting this film on, there you go. And drinkers went, yeah, okay, I like that, yeah. I realise you're just doing it to get me to drink more Stella, but I will, because you've done it in a sympathetic way.
Pete, I'm a startup co-founder, which is growing every day. So startups usually grows by the venture capitals. And let me share a secret with you. Venture capital mostly don't like to inventors. They want you to copy something on the bigger markets, okay? And because in Pubinno, we are the inventor, we have 7 patents behind of us, our technology. Sometimes it's difficult to tell what we do, especially, beer is so specific. Behind of the bar is a secret, very specific. Problems on there, it's not easy to tell. Why this couldn't be invented 50 years ago, something, that kind of answer. So I always start to my pitch like, imagine describing the whole history in 20 images. Beer would be in at least 2 of them. The first comes from the oldest recipe in the history. The second comes from the pub. Pub is for public house. So, therefore, we know that pubs are a very important meeting point in the history. So many historical critical points happened in the pubs, in Baviera, in London, so many things. So, in your opinion, what makes beer so ancient, connected to nations and their histories?
It's absolutely true. I think there's a to talk about it, but things are a bit nicer once you've had a drink. The world is slightly fuzzier. You feel a bit warmer. You feel more relaxed. This is the stuff we're not allowed to talk about in advertising. But drinking alcohol in moderation is good for you. It does have health benefits that outweigh the downsides if you drink moderately. And that's the hard thing, of course, is say, I've had my 2 pints, I'm going to stop now. But it's a fact that if you go anywhere in the world, all alcoholic drinks begin with fermentable sugars in plants. And in any part of the world, human beings who lived in that part of the world managed to work out how to take the sugars from plants and turn them into alcohol. So in ancient Greece, it was grapes and they made wine. In Japan, it was rice and they made sake. In Ireland, it was apples and they made cider. So wherever you go, we make alcoholic drinks from the fruits and vegetables that grow there. And in a big part of the world, it's barley. And so we made beer. And I think there's something special to beer, which is that, if you drink enough of anything, you're going to get drunk. And when you drink beer, that process is much slower. So that lovely middle bit where you're feeling really warm and friendly and fuzzy takes a lot longer than it does if you go out and rush, you're drinking vodka, you're hammered within an hour. Whereas you can drink beer for many hours before you get to, and you can moderate it. You can get to a certain level and then not get any drunker. You just space it out, and a lot of places where people drink beer, they don't intend to get drunk. They reach states that in different languages there's different words for it. But there's a special word in many different languages which is not directly translatable. And in English, the closest we have to it is buzzed. So you say, okay, I'm getting a little buzz, and then I'm going to drink slowly and steadily to keep that level of buzz and to not get any more drunk than this. And that's something I found when I wrote my book, Three Sheets to the Wind. People draw a big difference between being drunk and being buzzed. And that's a really nice state to be in. And because it's a state where everything around drinking is designed to increase, drinking beer is designed to increase sociability. We have rituals, we clink glasses, we make toasts, we buy drinks in rounds. There's a lot of sharing that goes on in beer. And it's also a very democratic drink where beer is often a sign that we're putting class prejudices and things like that to one side. So we are, years ago when Barack Obama had a White House summit with a white policeman and a black professor who the policeman had arrested, Obama got them to the White House for a beer, because if they were there drinking beer, then everyone was equal. You weren't the president and the vice president of the United States and a policeman and a professor. You were just four guys drinking beer. And so I think there's something very symbolic about that.
So many of the books you have written talk about the history of the beer, pub, and many more related topics. I believe one of the most fundamental qualities for forecasting the future of an industry is knowing its history deeply. We have talked about beer's past, and now let's turn our eyes to the future. So, in the light of all this knowledge, what do you think, Pete, about the future of the beer? I mean, as Pubinno, we are not alone. There are so many technology companies that try to revolutionize the industry. How do you forecast the future?
I had a full answer to that. I'd be able to make a lot of money out of it. We're drinking less. Not in every country, but in mature beer drinking countries, we're drinking less. People want to be healthier, and they do see beer as being unhealthy. I think beer is becoming more of a treat, less of an everyday thing. So what that means is, I don't think it's ever going to disappear. But what it means is that when I want a beer, it needs to be a bit more special than it was before. So people are looking for, on the branding side, people are looking for more premium brands. On the product side, I think they're looking for more consistency, also more originality, more innovation. And I'm writing at the moment about functional beers with extra health benefits, from using nootropics or CBD or things like that. So I can't decide. I think a lot of these things will prove to be fads and they will disappear, but I think some of them will stick around and change. And we're going to want more from our beer in future, and we want it to be more environmentally sustainable. We want to know that the company behind it cares about the future of the planet as well as just drinking, and we're always going to want something new. So they're my very, very broad predictions.
Now I have a surprise for you. In our season 2, we have a small game. It's a quick beer game. I will ask you some questions, which is these or these. So I need to get your answers in 3 seconds. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Okay, let's start. Edinburgh or Manchester?
Edinburgh.
IPA or stout?
Always IPA.
Always IPA, he say. All right. Thanks for your answers. So, it's wonderful how deeply you deal with history and society. You mentioned that in 20s and 30s, pubs emptied and beer itself became seen almost as a thing of the past. And as you said, in the future, the consuming of beer will be less, but people will be look for more quality, more customized tastes, etc. And let's look at today, to the new post-COVID normal, where people are also shifting away from pubs. By the way, if I recall correctly, there has never been a time in British history when pubs were forced to close, except in COVID. Considering Metaverse and AI rise following the COVID era, change await the world, and we can't help but think what the reflections on pubs will be. I want to ask you, considering these developments in technology, what do you think the future of pubs?
There's some really interesting things starting to happen. I think when you look at a typical UK household, 20 years ago, they didn't have as many TV channels. They didn't have instant food and drink delivery to your front door. They didn't have plasma screen TVs. They didn't have fast broadband Wi-Fi and screens in every room and personal screens. And we've got all those things now, and it's changed the way we socialize. It's changed the way we interact with other people, with our families, in the house, and even outside. There will always be a space for the pub. I think that the fact that we spend more time on our own, the fact we spend more time online, means that those real life occasions when we get together in a pub are even more special than they used to be. But I think they will happen less often. And then there's the way that technology enhances that occasion and changes it. So the really big thing we've seen in the UK, which I've just seen research on, especially among younger drinkers under 30, is they will now, if they're going to visit a pub or a bar, they will now check online to see what that pub is serving, and they will make their choice of drink before they leave the house to go to the pub. So by the time they get there, they may even have ordered their drink before they get to the pub. And the interesting thing about that is if you look at a pub's website, if you look at their online menus, the first thing they list is their cocktails, their gins, and their spirits. Often beer isn't even mentioned on the online drinks menus. And so what we've got is people deciding to drink a cocktail before they get to the pub. They're not even looking at the beer. They're not even seeing the beer. And so now in the UK, only 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds drink beer when they go to the pub. About 40% of them drink cocktails instead. So we're seeing this complete shift, and beer brewers have to work out what they're going to do to get back in touch with these younger drinkers who are choosing their drinks. They go online, they see the cocktails, they're a cocktail. And it's only people my age and above who are going to the bar, looking at what beers are on the bar and making a choice while you're there. So that's just one example of how technology is going to change things. But, pubs that embrace technology will thrive, and those that say, we're a pub, not an internet cafe, they're going to start struggling.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Also, another trend, all the things are shifting to draft. Wine, cocktail, even water. Everything is going to draft to be more sustainable world. We have to, in my opinion.
Yes.
In this climate crisis, we all people have to be more careful about our planet. So, Pete, we both know that draft beer is the best and the tastiest form of the beer. Unfortunately, its consumption has been declining in the world for the last 20 years. And in your words, if you want draft to survive, you need to change the conversation and actions around it. So can I ask you to expand on that a little bit? How to secure the future of draft beer?
You already mentioned one of the very big ways, which is the sustainability. If you look at cask ale in the UK, you have one container which is reusable, which gets delivered to the pub full, and then it goes back to the brewery empty, gets washed and filled again. Now, the amount of glass or plastic to deliver those drinks as individual servings would be huge. And we're not really talking to consumers about that. We're not talking to drinkers about that story. And it's a story they're interested in. So I think that's one very big way of talking about it. I think the other thing is an issue that draft has is Instagrammability is now a big factor in choosing drinks. Cocktail competitions now have the Instagram value of a drink as one of the judging criteria for that drink. And draft beer gets poured out at the bar. If it's a beer, it's a pale gold liquid. It comes back in a glass. and it's not. You don't want to put that on Instagram. You're going to get envy of someone else who's got a purple cocktail with things growing out of it and all that kind of stuff. So I don't agree with that. I'm not like that myself, but a lot of people are. And so you have to think about the visual appeal of beer and draft products generally much more than we used to have to.
As I said in our conversation, the pubs are also experience center for the beer marketing channel. And for the draft, in the last 2 decades, its consumption decreased almost 50%. There are 2 reasons behind of it. For the bar's perspective, losing the profit because of the waste, and it's untakeable. For the consumer side, the quality is not standard. So, what do you think about the quality control for the draft? What is the best draft for you, and how to handle the sustainable quality?
So we're talking, I do a lot of work. We're talking a bit about cask ale, which is a specific form of draft, in that it's still a live unpasteurized product in the cask. And it's a curious thing, because if you get a pint of cask ale when it's in great condition, it's the best beer you'll ever have. But just before it gets to that perfect condition, and just after that perfect condition, it's not as good. And if it's not good, it doesn't sell as quickly. If it doesn't sell as quickly, it stays on the bar for longer. If it stays on the bar for longer, the quality goes down. And so you're just into that cycle. So we have to make sure that you get the throughput. And there's a lot of things like around that. So stocking fewer brands. The number of brands on any bar has massively increased this century. And we maybe a lot of bars are maybe selling too many different products. Sometimes you go into a bar and you see 7 mainstream lagers, and it's like, you need 2 or 3 of those. 7, they're just sitting there in the pipes. They're not going through fast enough. I think we should try strategies that reduce waste. If we go into supermarkets in the UK, if you have fresh perishable produce, which is nearing its sell-by date, then people put big yellow stickers on it and reduce its price. So why can't we say, this beer is fresh on, it's beautiful, it's perfect, it's £5 a pint. This beer's been on for 3.5 days, it's getting a little bit tired, reduced it to clear, that's £1.99 a pint. We do it every day in the supermarket. I don't know why we don't do that in pubs. And then it's also compensating publicans for being fresh. A lot of the time, they don't want to waste it. They don't want to pour it down the drain. So they leave it on, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And they end up serving a lot more disgusting pints before eventually pouring it down the drain anyway. If there was a different thing they could do with that beer, if the brewer maybe takes it back after a certain time. These are all the conversations that are happening in the UK at the moment.
In my opinion, you can control it. The only way is with instant data. Data is your bigger helper to control the quality for every glass and prevent the waste. Especially nowadays. We are in the recession, and every drop matters for our plant. So, as a Pubinno CEO, I'm very proud. We helped save more than 500 million water to the world in 3 continents, more than 50 cities from Japan to Canada. And hopefully we will be in UK market soon. I think the pubs need it. So, yeah. Pete, you point out the beer has always been seen as a manly drink. Fast forward to today, although many of the gender stigmas have been challenged and discussed, I still believe that we have a long way to go in the beer industry. With the rapidly changing cultural norms, and thanks to organizations like Pink Boot Society. Have you ever heard of them?
Yeah, I've been to some of their events.
Great. Do you think the industry is ready for a new form of marketing? Do you think that the gender status of beer is changing in society right now?
Weird marketing strategy, isn't it? To try and alienate 50% of your potential user base. And it's very much a cultural thing. I think a lot of people perceive that there's something in beer itself. Maybe it's fizzy, it's bloating. Women wouldn't like the taste of it because it's too bitter. Those kind of things. And they don't really stand up to scrutiny. The issue really is how beer is presented in a cultural sense. And you can tell this because in my figures are maybe a little bit out of date now, but when I was studying this, in the UK, about 80% of beer volume was drunk by men, only 20% by women. But in Spain, at the same time, 40% of beer volume was drunk by women. It's the same kind of beer. But in Britain, we'd spent decades advertising beer with very macho imagery, women being treated in a very subservient way. And in Spain, beer had not been marketed in that way. The marketing had not alienated women. So a lot more women were drinking beer. So it's definitely a cultural construct. And I think we just have to try and remove that. You know, you don't get started. I talk to other people about this. I say, you know, is an iPhone more masculine or feminine? Is a Starbucks coffee more masculine or feminine? And it's like, well, what are you talking about? They're neither. And it's like, okay, so why does beer have to be masculine then? And I think it's interesting in France that when you have the gendered definite article in France, beer is la bière, not le bière. It's beer is feminine in France. Brewers were originally women, so there's no reason women shouldn't. And I think the beer industry now is confronting the sexism issue. It is confronting the way that women have been treated. And there is now a lot of work happening to try and change that. And rightly so, A, because it's wrong, and B, because you've got all these people there who aren't currently drinking beer who could have been drinking it.
You mentioned about Spain. We are also operating in Spain, in Madrid, in hundreds of bars. Spain is also a very unique market. The on-trade is very strong there, and the cake consumption is around 25% of the whole consumption. It's still so far from the UK. Also, the chains are so strong. In the Spain on-trade, 50% of the Spain on-trade comes from the chains. But the biggest chain, even the biggest chain, has, I mean on the pubs, has 800-900 stores. Okay? But UK is a very unique position in all around the world. It's famous with their chains such as Star Pubs, Wetherspoons, Green King. So I'm really curious about Pete. Why are pub chains are so common in the UK? It has any sociological meaning behind of it.
I think there are two answers to that question. There's a very practical one, which is that the brewers used to own all the pubs, as I said earlier. And in the early 1990s, the law changed, and it was like, okay, if you brew beer, you're no longer allowed to own all the pubs. They tried to cut off that vertical integration. And so what you had is tens of thousands of pubs all going up for sale at the same time, which is just a stupid situation that they should have foreseen. And so these pubs were all bought by global investment banks, and the chains were created because there was no other way that those pubs were going to be sold by the brewers who'd been legally forced to sell them. And actually what happened in most cases was the brewery had been going for 300 years. They'd acquired the pubs. They were told you're no longer allowed to own the pubs. So what a lot of breweries did was sell the brewery and keep hold of the pubs and become property companies instead. So you get these private estates of thousands of pubs. So there's a very specific reason why it's happened in the pub world. But also I think the UK is just more, it's more brand led than most other countries. I find it striking when I go to other parts of Europe. Wherever else I go, there are fewer ads. There seems to be less emphasis on celebrities, fewer posters. I don't feel like I'm shouted at by brands all the time in the way that I am in the UK. So I think I still haven't worked out why that is, but we're definitely more into our branded chains and our celebrity culture than a lot of other countries are.
Thanks for your answer. Pete, let's jump into the world from Britain. The world beer market is very consolidated market. The 10 big beer brands share the almost 75% of the market. There are a lot of mergers and acquisitions starting in 90s. These all occurred in the times very soon. Why do you think that is, and how does this affect the end consumer habits?
What's interesting is how not consolidated it was before this activity started to happen. If you look at any other market in the world, and you say, what's the biggest burger chain? McDonald's. What's the biggest sneaker chain? Nike. What's the biggest coffee brand? Starbucks. And it's okay. What's the world's biggest beer brand? And you go, oh, actually, I'm not sure. People think it's Heineken because it's in more countries than any other beer. People might think it's Budweiser because it's American and most big brands in the world are American. The biggest beer brand in the world is actually Snow in China, which hardly exists outside China. And beer, until this merger activity, beer was unique in terms that it was still very, very local. It was a lot more local than most other products. And in nearly every country, there's hundreds of countries around the world that are all wearing Nikes and eating McDonald's, but the local beer brand is the number one beer. That country's biggest brand is the number one beer in nearly every big beer drinking country. So there's just something about beer that is more local than a lot of other products. But it exists in an international world, and that world is getting much smaller. And so what happened with the consolidations in the 90s and in the 21st century was, I think, beer catching up very late with the way that a lot of other markets already are. And now it's doing that very, very quickly. And it seems to be much quicker and much bigger because everywhere else had already consolidated except beer. And it's happening in mature markets because there's very little growth in your own market. And so the only way to grow and satisfy shareholder demand is to buy the other guy. And so there's just been this big rush. And then you get, once that starts, you get the consolidation fever where it's like, well, if we don't go out and buy somebody, someone's going to come and buy us. So we've got to get bigger in order to get too big to buy. and so you get that all happening.
So it's a really very fruitful and lightful conversation for me. I really want to meet you in person soon. By the way, are you based in London?
London, yeah.
London, okay. I'm really visiting there. The next time, hope to cheers with you. So now let's raise our appetites. I would love to hear a description of fresh beer from an industrial legend like you. Pete, can you illustrate the most delicious and fresh beer for you?
So I think beer is tied up with that. The first beer you get on draft, especially after a hard day's work, especially if the weather's hot, and the anticipation that you feel for that beer has been used so often. The sound of a can ring pull opening is a very evocative sound, like the sound of a wine cork being pulled out of a bottle. But for me, nothing beats, especially because beer is served in a bigger glass, especially when the beer is clear, the pour from the tap, and watching the glass and the foam just growing. And then if the glass is cold, condensation forming on the outside of the glass. So it's looking refreshing, it's looking cool. The carbonation, the bubbles, you just know that that's going to be very thirst quenching when it hits your throat. So by the time you get the beer, you're almost desperate for it. And what I love to do is, I think when serious beer writers and connoisseurs like me, quite rightly, you spend a lot of time sniffing a beer if you're really tasting it. There's a difference between tasting a beer and drinking a beer. And I much prefer drinking a beer. So I get a big glass of it and I take a big gulp, So the first that much out the top of the glass goes straight down until the bubbles are getting so intense that you have to stop drinking because you're going to hurt your throat. And then just that feeling of refreshment afterwards, it releases endorphins from your brain. It makes you feel happier way before the alcohol kicks in. There's just the satisfaction of that reward, that cold beer hitting the back of your dusty throat, and the way it just takes the day's dust and the day's croakiness away as it goes down your throat. And it's genuinely refreshing. So that first pint refreshment.
Cheers to delicious pint of beer. Hopefully we will drink a Pubinno perfect beer with you soon.
Very soon.
Also, besides of the market consolidation, there is a big craft revolution all around the world. For me, Brewdog is the pioneer of that revolution. I also meet with you in their hotel room, Manchester, When I entered the room, it's crazy. And suddenly I saw your book, and hopefully in this season 2 we will host one of the co-founder of BrewDog. I really excited to talk with one of them. So, Pete, I want to finish by asking you about the famous pub jokes. Do you have one that you love at a lot?
I do. I'm just wondering if it will translate to an international audience. Let's see if it works. So a guy walks into a pub with a steering wheel down the front, a car steering wheel down the front of his pants. And the barman says, "God, that looks uncomfortable." And the guy says, "Yeah, it's driving me nuts."
Yeah, it's, for the international audience, it could be a little bit hard, but
yes,
maybe we can put some subtitle for it. So, thanks a lot, Pete. It's really an honor for me to talk with you in a fruitful and lightful conversation. Everyone, thanks for being with us tonight, the first episode of season 2. We will keeping with you with the new surprises and new great guests. It was a pleasure to be you tonight. Thanks to Pete Brown for sharing great experience with us. Don't forget to follow Pubinno for recent developments in the industry, and see you at the second episode of season 2. Bye-bye.